Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Living Life. Today, we're going to give you a little introduction to what this podcast is all about. We're going to be talking about why we chose the name Living Life. We're going to give you a little background on what we do and who we are and why we're giving this podcast. And we want to give you a sneak peek into some of the subjects that we would like to discuss on this podcast. My name is Ryan Brooks, and I'm here with Boyd Brooks, pastor, counselor, licensed counselor, you name it, and of course my dad. And I'm excited to start this project with you. I think we're going to talk about a lot of interesting subjects that need to be talked about. And like any new thing, I think it's important just to start and see where it leads. And that's kind of what we're doing with this podcast. Let's talk about why we chose this name. I know you and I bounced different ideas back and forth, but you have a passion for the family, which is why you recently wrote a book called Responsive Parenting, which I have right here. I have these in my car all the time, in case I give it to somebody, but we'll talk more about the book. But you have a passion for the family, and that's kind of where this podcast stems from. So let's talk about that some.
So Living Life Podcast is really a natural name for what we are doing. We recently did a Facebook Live, and that's the first experience we had at doing this. Then we kind of bounced the idea around of maybe doing some podcasts on a regular basis. And living life sums up the essence for me of the Christian life, which is authenticity, authentically living the Christian life. And the hardest place to live the Christian life is with the people you live with. It's not hard to live the Christian life with someone that's 10,000 miles away from you, but with the family where you live. And that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is working with families. And so we wanted to do something on a regular basis that will help you understand and be able to apply biblical principles to your life that are going to help you live this life more authentically.
So you recently did a sermon series at our church, and it's called Principled Living. And I know you're talking about a lot of key subjects that affect all of us. What are some of those subjects that you're going to be talking about in these next few weeks?
So I'm presenting a different principle every week, and I began it several weeks ago, but I've selected 20 different principles, and here is a list of those: forgiveness, self-control, respect, responsibility, accountability, humility, kindness, generosity, diligence, faith, integrity, courage, trust, teachableness, faithfulness, compassion, enthusiasm, gratitude, magnanimity, which is magnanimous, and then redemption. So we want to do a podcast on each one of these each week.
Yeah, and one thing too that we've discussed is we want you guys, and I'll mention this at the end as well, so I'll remind you, but we want this to be helpful to you. We want this podcast to be something that you can go to where it's 10 minutes or less, and you can get some answers on different subjects. But you may have other questions, or maybe you have a subject that you would like to talk about. Definitely send those questions in. I'll tell you where to send those in here in just a minute. But probably, for those listening, maybe we should kind of give them, I kind of mentioned earlier a little bit, but what is our background and what do we do? Kind of give me a little bit of that.
So my ministry began as a youth pastor, and then spent almost a quarter of a century in Latin America, mostly Argentina, planting churches, Bible school director, and then almost the last 20 years as pastor of People's Church, where I am presently. But I dedicate a lot of my time to working with families, as I have a background, a doctorate in psychology, and I'm a licensed counselor, and I see over the years hundreds and hundreds of families, especially young families, working on marriage and parenting. Out of that came the book Responsive Parenting, and just recently written a study guide that we're going to be putting as a free resource on our website. So this podcast of the principles really flows out of my background. This is something that has been just so dear to my heart the whole life, my whole life. This proverb 15:19 says, "The way of the sluggard is blocked with thorns, but the path of the upright is a highway." So these principles for the the principled person who really loves these principles, applies them, they become a highway, like the track the train runs on, or the airstrip for the plane to land and take off on. The unprincipled life, there's just series of obstacles. As Proverbs says, it's like crawling through thorns. And most of those obstacles are created by the mistakes, their own mistakes, because their decisions are not weighed off of biblical principles. So I'm excited to be able to present these principles. They really flow out of what my life and ministry has been.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I think as being a youth pastor here at People's Church as well, I know I'm going to learn some stuff as we talk out these subjects, but I do kind of remember real quick before we kind of wrap this up, I remember just growing up overseas and, you know, that dynamic of moving and making new friends and then all of a sudden you're kind of like, hey, we got to move again. And, you know, that was a difficult time as a kid. I was leading up to this podcast, I was thinking about when you told us that we couldn't keep our dog. You know, we had to leave him behind, you know, which just seems kind of sad, but the circumstances made it difficult. And I remember those kind of situations, even though they were difficult at times, I really believe that living overseas has given me a different mindset as far as my faith, my ministry. And I love seeing the church move forward. And so I hope that these podcasts will just help people to move forward and just live life, which is what the podcast is all about, living life. So as I mentioned earlier, we want this podcast to be helpful for you. So if you have a question or maybe even a subject that you'd like to see us talk about, we might take a podcast with just your questions and answer those. Send those in to boyddbrooks@gmail.com, and that's BOYD, the initial D, BROOKS@gmail.com. Or another easy way is just to go to the website, boyddbrooks.com, and there's a contact us section right there. As I mentioned earlier, you wrote a book called Responsive Parenting. You can find all that out at the website. Thanks again for listening today to Living Life. We'll see you next time. If you're watching this, just be sure to maybe turn on the notifications or follow us, whatever you got to do. That way you can get an update when the next video is going to come out. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Bye. Once I was standing in line at a huge hardware store waiting to pay for something, and the line was long, and I was just looking around at everything, and my little 2-year-old son tugged on my hand and said, "What's it look like from up there, Daddy?" So I actually knelt down and looked at things from his perspective, and it was pretty incomplete. Shoes, knees. So I picked him up, set him on the counter right beside me, and he said, "Wow, things really look different from up here." That's what I want to do for parents. I want to give them a different perspective of parenting. I've written a book entitled Responsive Parenting. It's written to young parents just starting out, parents who have kids of any age, and even grandparents. In my more than 30 years of seeing parents and families as a counselor and a pastor, for me, parenting divides into 2 categories: reactive parenting and responsive parenting. Reactive parenting is parenting from reaction, your own anxiety or your child's anxiety. It's putting out fires. It's dealing with the moment. But responsive parenting is parenting with a long view for the child's best interest. It's parenting with biblical principles. I didn't invent this. I didn't make it up. I just discovered it and wrote it down. It's what really makes a difference in families. Reactive parenting is so repetitive because parents parent the same way they learned. And if they didn't see a lot of conflict resolution and they live with conflict, they tend to pass that conflict on to their children. And children exposed to conflict are going to have problems. Whereas responsive parenting is about connecting families and helping them resolve conflict. It's not the 1, 2, 3, solve it in 48 hours. This is a long view, but it transforms families.
Responsive Parenting, Principles for Raising Connected and Healthy Kids by Boyd Brooks. Available at boydbrooks.com.